Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 5, Halacha 2, and the Art Scroll. We're on 47a3. This is going to be an interesting one because we're dealing with a vineyard that is going to be overcrowded. Now, this is an issue that comes up that you should know about, like why do we care about an overcrowded orchard, an overcrowded field, an overcrowded vineyard? Because your yields are going to go down. You know, we covered this in Masechet Shvius chapter 1 about an overcrowded orchard. And the problem with overcrowding the orchard is that each tree is going to steal nutrients from the other tree and your crop yield is going to go down. You're not going to get as much fruit. Now, if you're a farmer, this is your parnassah. You want to get as much yield as possible. That's why you want to have rational fields that are spaced properly where each tree is getting the right amount of nourishment, and that way it can produce productively. It can produce enough fruit to feed your family and sell and to do all of the holy things that you have to do in the year, like buy an etrog and things like that. You need to have parnassah, and in order to do that, you have to have fields that are rational. One of the issues here is going to be, well, what happens if you're overcrowding your vineyard? Well, your yields are going to go down. But we talked about this over in Masechet Shvius chapter 1. You know, there are times where you're not necessarily growing trees and wood for fruit. You're growing it because you want to have firewood. Now you say, well, what about cutting down fruit trees? Isn't that forbidden by the Torah? And the case over that is going to be, well, if the firewood is going to be at a greater value than the fruit, you're allowed to do it. So over here, the question is going to be, well, if somebody's overcrowding a vineyard, maybe they're growing it for firewood. And so we're going to deal with the laws of that. And also, this is going to touch on perhaps a related topic. What happens if you're overcrowding a graveyard? Is that going to have the halachic status of a graveyard? Over here, we want to know if you're overcrowding a vineyard, is that going to have the halachic status of a vineyard? And over there, as the counterpoint to this, in trying to evaluate the overcrowding of a vineyard, we're going to look at overcrowding a graveyard. Now, the Mishnah is going to say that if a vineyard is planted at intervals of less than 4 amos, Rabbi Shimon says it's not a vineyard. It's just going to be regarded as a collection of individual vines. In other words, there's not enough room around the vines so that you can have a work area. You can't bring an ox in there. You can't bring a wagon in there. And so because it's not really a working vineyard, it's just a collection of vines. And that means that you can plant foreign seed within 4 amos of it. You can do it up to 6 tefachim because they're seen as individual vines. Now, this is not going to be the opinion of the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama is going to say that, no, this is actually still going to be a vineyard, but there's going to be, a disqualification process, and we're going to get into that. And so the issue here is that what happens if you're overcrowding a vineyard? The Rambam is going to be saying about this that vines spaced less than 4 amma intervals do not constitute a vineyard because they don't develop properly in a crowded condition. And if they don't develop properly, why are you growing it like this? Well, maybe you're growing it because you're intending to have firewood. Maybe you're not trying to grow grapes. This is the wood that you have. And this is, easy for you to grow, and it's good for the land, and you're gonna use it to make charcoal or something like that. Well, you're allowed to do that. If the value of your charcoal that you're making out of your wood is going to be higher than whatever crop you're going to be doing, you can do it. But the idea is going to be, well, what if you do have a vineyard? And what if you have it where it is spaced too close? Well, maybe the guy had a properly spaced vineyard in the beginning, and then now he's planting some plants later for firewood. What about something like that? Well, that's what the sages are going to be getting into. The sages are going to say in this Mishnah that it is a vineyard, and we're going to view the intervening vines that are going to encroach on this 4 amma space that should be between the rows as though they were non-existent. And that is a big chiddush. In other words, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is coming and saying that this is not a vineyard at all. These are just individual collections of vines. Let's say you've spaced this at 2 amas each. He basically is going to be saying that you're really growing this for firewood. This is not a vineyard. This is not a production field. You can't even get between here to start picking grapes on a production level. You can't get a wagon in. You can't get baskets in. Nothing's going to fit. Well, the sages are saying, well, maybe what happens here is that this is still a vineyard, but you're going to look at the other vines that are planted as too close as being disqualified. In other words, perhaps what happened is somebody had a properly spaced vineyard in the beginning, and now they just planted an extra couple of vines in here to take as firewood later. Well, the sages are going to say that what you're going to do is you're going to disqualify the ones that are too close. So let's imagine this for a second. We know that, and this is what it's teaching us, that if you're planting a vineyard, you have to have spacing of 4 amos. Why? Because you need to fit things through. No problem. And this, by the way, is not talking about planting foreign seed. This is not talking about planting other species. This is talking about putting a grapevine next to grapevines next to grapevines. And so over here, we're saying that, look, if the guy went and planted them at 3 amma intervals, you're going to start creating a system of ignoring the one that is 3 amas away and only counting the one that is beyond it. So for instance, you're going to have in row 1, you're going to have row 2, that's 3 amos separating it, and then row 3, there's going to be 3 amos separating row 2 and row 3. What you're going to do is you're going to look at, you're going to take out and imagine that the one that's 3 amos apart doesn't even exist, and you're going to look at this one and that one, which is 6 amos apart. And you're going to say that this is a vineyard, but this one in here in the middle, we're going to treat it like firewood. It's not going to be a vineyard, and we're not going to look at it. It's going to be like it didn't exist. And the idea is that we're going to say that it's like you've planted it for firewood. And so we're going to look at this in a lens of saying that some of these exist and some of these don't. And we're going to ignore the ones that are shorter than 4 amos. And then everything that is longer than 4 amos, we're going to draw together as the vineyard. So the Gemara is going to come with this back and forth of how this is going to work, with this back and forth between Rabbi Shimon and the sages about whether this is a vineyard and whether this is not a vineyard. Rabbi Shimon says back to the sages in this Gemara, those vines about which you say that we view the intervening vines as though they were non-existent are, in fact, and the essence of the vineyard. That's what he's saying, that these are the essence of the vineyard. He's saying that these intervening vines, like what we were talking about with our 3 rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, basically the sages are saying, look, just ignore the middle row, because row 1 and row 2 are planted 3 amos apart instead of 4 amos apart. And row 2 and row 3 are planted 3 amos apart instead of 4 amos apart. You take out the middle vine, pretend like it's not there, and row, what's your vineyard? Your vineyard is going to be row 1 and row 3, which is 6 amos apart from each other, and you're going to view the middle row as if it doesn't exist. That's what the Tanakama point is. And Rabbi Shimon is coming and saying, no, this is part of the vineyard, and it's not a vineyard. These are individual vines. This doesn't qualify as a vineyard. This is not the definition of a vineyard. A definition of a vineyard is it has to be planted within 4 amos of one another. And he's saying that these intervening vines that are going to be uprooted are uprooted from the outset. And perhaps the vines that you're labeling as being for firewood or something like that, well, that perhaps maybe that's going to be destined to remain. Maybe he's not going to use it as firewood. Maybe he's just a bad farmer and this is considered his vineyard and he's just going to keep it. Maybe the guy doesn't know what he's doing. And so, the sages are saying that perhaps the guy does know what he's doing and he just put a couple of vines in here for firewood later and he's going to uproot it later. Rabbi Shimon says, well, maybe the guy is just not doing it right. And this is an integral part of a very badly planted vineyard. And because this doesn't qualify as a vineyard and he has no intention of uprooting anything, Rabbi Shimon is coming and saying that the whole thing is the vineyard. And none of it is imagined as being disappearing. And really all of it is worthless. It's all firewood. It's all individual vines. And so if you want to look on the outside of this collection of vines, you can plant foreign seed on the outside 6 tefachim away. Why? Because each of these vines is just going to be a set of individual vines. Your vines have to be rationally planted. That is what we're seeing in chapter 5. And what we're seeing is there's an alignment issue. All of these rows have to be in a line, not only from the north-south direction, but east, as we're seeing here in the last halacha, in chapter 5, halacha 1, from an east-west direction as well. You take a string, you draw a string along it, and it's got to run along the string. And what we're seeing over here is what happens if you're planting them too close. Well, Rabbi Shimon is saying that you planted them too close. It doesn't qualify as a vineyard. It's not a vineyard. This is just a collection of vines. The Tanakama is coming and saying, no, these are not a collection of vines. These are going to be uprooted in the beginning. He intended that these are going to be uprooted, and he's going to take them out. Because he decided and had the intention that he's going to be uprooting these later on, you're drawing a line from the kosher vines, which are going to now, you're going to try to connect, up to 4 amos areas, and you're going to say like this one and that one will connect. Okay, it's a little bit bigger than 4 amos, but still it's going to be within 16 amos. We saw that you can have rows of vines that can connect with one another to form a vineyard, even up to 16 amos away. And these are going to be drawn in a line, and these ones you're going to imagine like they're not there because later on he's going to uproot these and take these out. That's what this malok's about. Whether you can imagine that they're non-existent or that they are existent. Whether it was done this way on purpose in the beginning or whether it was just badly done. Is it going to qualify as a vineyard if it was badly done? Rabbi Shimon says no. Tanakama says yes, because the guy must have known it's supposed to be 4 amos apart, and you're going to look like that this is a collection of a vineyard and firewood mixed in together, and he's going to take out part of it. That is the idea. Now the Gemara is going to try to figure out the rebuttal by Rabbi Shimon. How is Rabbi Shimon going to look at this? There's going to be 2 answers for how to do this. Rabbi Hanania says that this rebuttal by Rabbi Shimon says in effect that he's arguing with the sages only regarding a case where the vines are arranged in a row of 6 by 6. In other words, there are 6 rows going north and south, and there's 6 rows going east and west. That means that there's 36 vines here in this block. That is the explanation that Rabbi Hanania is giving for the case that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying. And he's saying that this 6-row vine, 36 in total, 6 by 6, in this case, it's going to be unclear which vines are going to be uprooted. That is going to be what Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Hanania, is arguing. He's saying back to the sages, you can't tell which is going to be uprooted. Very nice that you want to draw lines between ones that you're taking out. But Rabbi Shimon is saying, according to Rabbi Hanania, that if you have a 6 by 6 vineyard, well, you're uncertain which row is being removed. And that makes it impossible. In other words, you can't say which one is going to be uprooted. Therefore, the whole thing is really just counted as a collection of individual vines because you can't tell me on here which is going to be removed. And the Gemara is going to say, but if they were arranged in a row of 5 by 5, in other words, north-south is going to go 5 vines, and east-west is going to go 5 vines for a total of 25 vines, then it's going to be clear which vines are going to be uprooted. So in the case where you now have a bigger than 36 vine vineyard, Rabbi Shimon is pointing out that you can't create any situation where you can organize and tell me clearly which row is going to be removed. That is the rebuttal that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has. And the Gemara says that even Rabbi Shimon, agree that we view the intervening vines as though they were non-existent in a 5 by 5 row. Why? Because In a 5x5 row, it's going to be clear that row 2 and row 4 in this 5-row vine are not an essential part of the vineyard. In other words, that it's clear that these are going to be uprooted. And even Rabbi Shimon is going to agree that non-existent vines that are there from the outset are not part of a vineyard. Rabbi Shimon is not disputing the sages with somebody who overplants a vineyard and is going to intend in the beginning to uproot some of it for firewood, and some of it is going to be there. In other words, if you can draw a line and say that these vines are clearly going to be vineyard vines, and these vines here are going to be clearly for firewood, and you could draw a line and clearly say without any maloket which is going to be clearly removed, Rabbi Shimon even agrees that, yeah, these are essential parts of the vineyard vines, and these are going to be firewood vines. And this mix is going to be there, and everybody's going to agree. But the sages are going to say that since it's clear from the outset that some of these extra vines are going to be uprooted, and some of the vines are going to be destined to be more than 4 amos apart, then what's happening is that you can create where you can look at what is going to be the essential part of the vineyard. And the idea that the Chazan Ish explains about the sage's position in like a 5x5 vineyard is going to be that since it's not yet decided which rows are going to be removed, the vineyard is currently considered extending throughout these rows. And if you're gonna distance foreign seed from the outside of it, you have to still be 4 amos from all sides. Now, that's going to be interesting because, when we go back and we look at the 6-row vineyard, 6x6, we're getting to a case of uncertainty. If you imagine, in the north-south row, that there's going to be, 6 rows, you can't tell me that, which row is supposed to be taken out. Perhaps the first row, the third row, and the 5th row is going to be taken out. And then you're going to connect the remaining vines as the vineyard, which is going to be row 2, row 4, and row 6. And so your northernmost area is going to be completely removed as firewood. Rabbi Shimon would look at this 6-row vineyard and 36 vines. And by the way, it can be more than that, but this is going to be the minimum measure that Rabbi Shimon is pointing out, and say that, look, maybe you're not even going to take out row 1, 3, and 5. Maybe you're going to take out row 2, 4, and 6. And so if you take out row 2, 4, and 6, well, you're left with row 1, 3, and 5. So how do you look at it? It's uncertain. You can't tell which is an essential part of the vineyard. That's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's point. And that what he's really saying is that all the vines have to be treated as existing. And really, because all of the vines have to be treated as existing and it's not clear which is going to be removed, then it just doesn't meet the requirements of a vineyard. Why? Because it has to be 4 amos, and you can't tell me which ones you're going to imagine as disappearing. There's not a clear row that you're clearly removing. But in the case of a 5-row vineyard, it's going to be clear which ones you're going to be taking off. You're going to be taking off, even if you could be taking off row 2 and 4, or you could be taking off row 1 and 5. And since, in this case, row 2 and 4 are not going to be an essential part of the vineyard, they're just going to be these intervening vines that are going to be uprooted, then even Rabbi Shimon's going to agree that they're deemed not existent from the outset. With this uncertainty issue, there's an opposing opinion in this Gemara. Rabbi Manna says that this dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the sages was stated with regard to the following case, where the vines are arranged in a row of 5x5. That, by the way, will be 25 vines. And it says that if they were arranged in a row of 6x6, even the sages would agree that they do not constitute a vineyard, because which are the vines to which you would apply this principle, where it says that you view the intervening vines as though they were non-existent. Would it be these or would it be these? So Rabbi Manna's reading is a little bit different than Rabbi Hananiah's reading. He's basically saying that the maloket here between Rabbi Shimon and the sages is not about a 6x6 vineyard. And Rabbi Hanania was saying that it is by a 6x6 vineyard. Over here, Rabbi Mana is explaining that even the sages would say that Rabbi Shimon is right about the 6x6 vineyard. In other words, you're not sure which of these vines are going to be removed. And another way to look at the odd number of rows where it's going to be clear which are going to be the vines that you're going to keep and the intervening vines, well, that in that case, the sages are going to say that you can figure out which are going to be destined to be uprooted and which are going to be non-existent from the outset. But Rabbi Shimon dissents in Rabbi Mana's view, and he's holding that even in this case we can't be certain because maybe these intervening vines that would, the sages would say are destined to be uprooted, well, maybe they're not actually going to be uprooted at all, and maybe they were done incorrectly, and maybe they weren't done for firewood. So there's two ways to look at this, and in this way that Rabbi Mana is saying about the 6x6 vineyard, he's saying that the sages would agree that, look, you can't be sure which of the rows you're going to be taking off. And in the other case, even if you have the 25 vine vineyard, you can say like, okay, well, we can see which ones you're going to take off and which ones you're going to leave. Rabbi Shimon's retort to that is, well, how do you know he's taking it out? How do you know that that was really intended from the beginning? And that is going to be the maloket. And that's actually going to get into what we're going to be getting into later about the graveyard that's coming up. In other words, how do you know what their intent was? How do you know it was done right in the beginning? So the Gemara is going to actually expound on the words of the sages in the Mishnah, and it says, what is the meaning of that which we learned in our Mishnah, that we view the intervening vines as though they were non-existent? And really what we're going to be grappling with is, well, how non-existent are they? We know that if you take grapevines and you drape them over someone else's crop, that you've made a Kilayim issue. Grapes have tendrils, and anything that's growing over something is going to be disqualified because now it's intermingled and it looks like it was sewn together, and they're touching and they're overlapping, and it's no good for Kilayim. But if the sages are really going to say that it's non-existent, would that count? And so the Gemara says that Rabbi Huna says it means that even when, in this case, you're allowed to train vines over foreign plants. Why? Because these vines are treated as though they're completely uprooted from the ground. That is a big hiddush. So what this is trying to say is that if you have a branch of a vine and it actually goes over foreign plants, well, normally that's kalei karam, and that's very serious. But by stating that it's going to be allowed here, Rabbi Huna is trying to teach us how far this allowance goes by the sages, where you're going to really say it's uprooted and you're really going to say it's non-existent. So that even if you're actually physically putting it there, you're saying that it's not really there. Why are you doing it? Well, you're going to be looking at it as though it's already detached wood and it's already subordinate to the surrounding vineyard. And you're already going to be saying that, hey, it's just going to be used as firewood. It's not actually a Kilayim thing at all, and they're going to come cut it down at any moment. And, you're not even regarding the branches that's trained over something as being significant. So Rabbi Kanievsky is going to say about this that he's teaching this leniency with regard to the allowance of training the branches of the vines over foreign plants, and this can be applied to branches that extend beyond the 4 amma work area of the vineyard, in which case the foreign plants are not forbidden on account of the surrounding vines. So Rabbi Huna is clearly going to be following Rabbi Mana's approach about the maloket here, about the 25 vine vineyard versus the 6x6 vine vineyard, 36 vine vineyard. And basically what he's going to be saying is that the sage's ruling is only going to be where it's clear which are going to be destined to be uprooted. And that's the maloket between Rabbi Hanania and Rabbi Mana. Which vines are you going to be taking out? And, it has to be obvious and clear. And if it's not, then, it's not going to forbid the foreign planting. The Chazan Ish is going to be saying about this in his Kilayim book 11:13 that since any of these vines might be among those that will remain in the case of Rabbi Hananiah's position, where the sages are holding that the position will be even when it's unclear, which vines are destined to be uprooted. Over here, he's basically saying that all the vines would have to be treated as part of the vineyard itself. And so that's a big hiddush to try to understand this. So Rabbi Huna is teaching that the intervening vines are judged as their own standard of that uprooted vine, and they don't become subordinate to the vineyard where they're situated. Now, Rabbi Manna is going to continue this, and he is going to say that this teaching supports that which Rabbi Yossi said regarding the vineyard whose outer row is not aligned with the other rows. This is something that we learned in Chapter 5, Halacha 1, Part 3 of the Shir, where the alignment of the rows, they can't be chaotically done. They have to be in a row. It has to have a rational structure to it, both in a line going north and south, and also the vines have to be in a line going east and west. And the case that we had in the end of Chapter 5, Halacha 1, was 2 of the rows are going to be in alignment going east and west, certainly north and south. And this third row is going to be in alignment north and south, but not in alignment with the other 2 rows of vines going east and west. They're maybe in the middle. They're not lined up in a row. And so in that case, what would we have over here? Would that be something that would be obvious of what you're going to be uprooting? So the Gemara says that this teaching supports that which Rabbi Yossi said about this alignment. And it says that if there was a row of foreign plants within the 6 tefach work area of the outer row, that's going to be the row out of alignment, which is going to be within the 4 amma work area of the aligned 2 rows that do constitute a vineyard. This other one, because it's out of alignment, even though it's 5 vines, do not constitute a vineyard. And then everything is going to be rendered forbidden. In other words, both the vineyard and the underlined outer row is going to be forbidden. Why? Because it's within the 6 tefach of the outer row and within the 4 amma of the actual vineyard for those 10 vines in a row, the 2 rows of vines that are aligned. So in that case, everything is going to be forbidden. Now, it says that if, on the other hand, the plants were outside the 6 tefach work area on the outer row, but within the 4 amma work area of the aligned rows that do constitute a vineyard, the vines of Rabbi Yossi's ruling is based on the same principle of that of which Rabbi Huna is saying, that although the vines of the unaligned row are within the work area of the vineyard, they're judged by their own standard. In other words, that of single vines, and they do not become subordinate of the vineyard. And by the way, you might say, well, maybe these are the ones that would be removed and placed as firewood. So that might be a case where it's obvious of what is going to get torn out. What are you growing for actual production, and what are you growing for firewood? But over there, you're still going to have a setback. In other words, even if you're growing it for firewood, well, you still have to set it back and say that they're individual vines and set it back within 6 tefachim. And so if you were planting within 6 tefachim of this outer row that's unaligned, and also outside of the 4 amma, then you could have a case where you're allowing the main vineyard, but you're precluding what you'd be growing for firewood, because that is going to be a Kilayim issue. Because, how do you know? Maybe the guy will change his intent. Maybe the guy will decide to keep it for grapes. And so you have foreign species now growing within here. So, there are cases in planting where you also have to worry about Marasayan issues, where, a guy is going to walk by and see that you've planted something as if, it's within the 6 tefachim of this, and it's a grapevine, and, it's going to give a Marasayan problem. So you can have cases where, you're not sure what the guy's intention was in the beginning, and that's going to help to determine how you're going to designate something. And that's what we're getting into now, because we're getting into graveyards. In another Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon is maintaining that a vineyard planted at less than 4 amma intervals is not a vineyard. The sages are saying that it is a vineyard, and this relates to a dispute elsewhere about something called a district of graves. This, by the way, is connected back to a Mishnah in Oholos 16.3 and Nazir 9.3, stating that if 1 or 2 corpses are found buried in an area, and it wasn't known to be a graveyard, then it does not establish the area as a district of graves. It's not established as a graveyard. Why? Because there's no previous knowledge of graves in this location, and there was only 2 corpses found there. So we assume that maybe they were there temporarily and they didn't get transferred yet, or maybe they were put there and forgotten. And this is going to allow us to, now get into a position where, we can unearth these corpses and we can bury them elsewhere. You're generally not allowed to remove corpses from a permanent grave and transfer them to another site, and especially if we're in a graveyard. If you're in a graveyard, you'd say, well, this is a permanent thing. You're not supposed to move them. But if it's 1 or 2 corpses, you're allowed to move them, and you're trying to put them into a permanent place. Everything with the graveyard, by the way, is going to be dealt with with respect for the corpse. That's something that you always want to keep in mind. So you don't want to have overcrowding. You want to keep it where things are spaced properly, because it's disrespectful to the corpse. And we have to worry that, maybe there's going to be other corpses here in this case. And, why do we care about that? Well, maybe the area is a graveyard. Maybe it's tahor. Maybe it's tameh. If it's going to be a graveyard and there's going to be, 3 corpses that are unearthed within a space of, 4 to 8 amos, then this area of land is going to be established as a catacomb. And this is going to establish it as a final resting place, which means you can't, dig these people up and move them somewhere else. And if they're in a catacomb area, then all this ground is going to be tameh. So spacing of 4 to 8 amos is going to reflect the dimensions of a burial chamber. And in the opinion of the Tana, the catacombs are going to be comprised of 4 by 8 amma chambers, and it's going to be within 6 recesses for tombs built into 2 8 amma walls. And we're seeing over in the Tosefta and Oholos a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the sages about corpses that are found to be within the 4 amma area. So Rabbi Shimon over there is going to be arguing that since the catacombs do not hold more than 3 corpses in 4 amma separations, it's obvious it's not a catacomb. Why? Because maybe it got buried by dirt falling, and these bodies were elsewhere, and it, something fell into it, and it all sort of mingled together. The sages are going to hold a different position. They're going to be holding that it could be a graveyard, and it depends on how it was done in the beginning. And this, by the way, is getting back to our vineyard. How are you planting all this stuff in the beginning? Were you planting this because you're going to have some firewood in here, and it's obvious where your firewood's going to be, and this is not going to be part of the vineyard, and this over here is going to be the vineyard? Or are you saying that perhaps the vineyard is all just a collection of vines? It doesn't qualify as a vineyard. And that, by the way, is going to be like what Rabbi Shimon's position is over here in the graveyard. In other words, it has to be properly spaced in order to qualify. So we're going to get into what happens with your intent at the time of burial. And over here, it's basically going to be the same. What was your intent at the time of planting this vineyard? So Rabbi Shimon bar Ba in this Gemara says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, just as Rabbi Shimon and the sages disagree whether the vines planted too closely are going to constitute a vineyard, so too they disagree about if you find corpses buried too closely together, is it going to constitute a district of graves? Is it going to be a graveyard? So what is going to be the intent in the beginning? You found vineyards, vines that are planted too closely over here, and you also found graves and people that were corpses, and they were buried too closely together. Is that a vineyard and is that a graveyard? So the Gemara is actually going to object to the linking of this because maybe there is a difference, and it turns out there will be. Rabbi Yonah says that this case is not comparable to the case of this Mishnah because the corpses were properly spaced at the time of burial, and someone subsequently came and crowded them with additional corpses. So all agree they still have the status of a district of graves. Again, you want to know, is this a district of graves because maybe Kohanim could walk over here, Tamei Tahor issues, or, what happens if you find a district of graves and it doesn't qualify as a district of graves? Well, you have a responsibility to give them, an honorable burial and to respect them and to give them a final resting place. So since the corpses are going to assumed to be initially buried with the correct spacing, we're going to assume that the area is a proper burial ground in the beginning, says Rabbi Yonah, and then somebody else came and crowded it together. That's how he's going to be looking at it. He's not going to be looking at it as, these were a bunch of corpses and it wasn't done right in the beginning. So they're going to agree that the corpses were crowded together at the time of burial, and one came and rendered them properly spaced by unearthing the extra corpses, and in that case, they do not have the status of a district of graves. In other words, if you're coming to initially do a crowded burial, like a mass grave, and that's going to show that the area was not designated as a district of graves. And so really we want to know, how were the corpses buried initially? That's really what you're looking at. And again, how were the vines planted initially? Rabbi Yonah continues and he says, however, with regard to the vineyard, the determining factor is not the initial planting of the vines, but the current state of the vines. So it could be argued that Rabbi Shimon is looking at the current state of the vines and the current state of this burial ground. Rabbi Yonah is saying, don't link it together. You have to look at the current state of the vineyard, and you have to look at the initial planting of the graveyard. So here he's saying, with regard to the vineyard, the determining factor is not how you initially planted it, but the current state of the vineyard. And if the vines, says the Gemara, were properly spaced when they were planted, and then somebody came and crowded them by planting additional vines, perhaps, for firewood, this is going to be the case, he says, that's disputed by Rabbi Shimon and the sages. So this is a little bit different than what we saw with Rabbi Hananya and Rabbi Manna. They were saying that the dispute is going to be either a 25 or a 36 vine vineyard. Rabbi Manna and Rabbi Hananya hold that the position of each is flipped on what the argument is over whether it's going to be a 36 vine vineyard and they're going to agree about the 25 vine vineyard, or vice versa, they're going to agree about the 25 vine vineyard but disagree on the 36 vine vineyard. So over here, Rabbi Yonah is coming and saying that this is actually not the case. This is where we're having a maloket about if somebody came crowded and planted additional vines, and then this is going to be the case that's disputed by Rabbi Shimon and the sages. And conversely, says the Gemara, if the vines were crowded together when they were planted, and then somebody came and rendered them properly spaced by ripping out and uprooting the extra vines, everyone agrees, and even Rabbi Shimon, he's saying, agrees that it is a vineyard, since the vines are now spaced at 4 amma intervals. So he's saying that the law of the district of graves would be that a crowded vineyard is fundamentally different, and the two disputes between Rabbi Shimon and the sages are completely unrelated. So that's a very good point. The Gemara is going to conclude. It's going to say, when is the essence of the dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the sages with respect to the district of graves? It's going to say that they differ regarding the case where somebody came and found the corpses overcrowded, and he does not know how they were originally buried. So this uncertainty about how the corpses were originally done in this now crowded state is going to be, were these properly spaced and then they got crowded later on, or was it done this way? And so the answer is going to be different on the halacha. If you didn't, you did it like a mass grave, you just threw them all in there, and that was how you initially did it, that's not a district of graves. If you came along and you did it properly, and then somebody came in after and threw some corpses in there, that's still going to have the halachic status of a district of graves. Why? Because it's how your intent was when you first did it. Rabbi Shimon is going to say that, I say that a heap of rubble fell on them and buried them and crowded them together, and therefore it's not going to signal a district of graves. He's basically going to be saying that that since it's disrespectful to crowd corpses together, we're going to assume that these corpses were not interred by a person, and it was not done at one stage or even in two stages. Rather, it was a heap of rubble that fell on them and buried them and crowded them together. So perhaps it's a catacomb over a catacomb, and there was an earthquake, and this fell onto that, and all of the corpses sort of got intermingled. And that is the kind of example that he's saying. In other words, if all of the corpses were buried this way from the start, then this is not a district of graves. And if they were buried in two stages, then it would be a district of graves. He's saying that no, actually, they were clumped together by, not even by a person. It was just like a natural thing and an upheaval of the earth, and it all sort of smushed everything together. But the rabbis don't say like that. They say that we assume that the corpses were properly spaced at the time of burial, and then somebody came and added the corpse and crowded them. And in that case, they're going to signal a district of graves. Why are they going to signal a district of graves? Because the rabbis are saying that they did it in respect in the beginning, which triggers it in the start as the status to have the district of graves. And then somebody later on came and added some corpse and overcrowded them. But really, since it's going to be already established as a district of graves, even by overcrowding it later on, you didn't change the status. Now, Rabbi Shimon is going to hold that people will never bury dead people so close together, and even by adding graves to an existing burial ground. He's saying that people aren't going to do it, and it's not likely that it was intentionally done by a person. It must have come by some other way, even, by the way, perhaps even unintentionally, but people are never going to do that, according to Rabbi Shimon. So in this dispute, in the case of the crowded vineyard and the legal status of the overly crowded vineyard, we're going to see that it's dealing with an assumption that maybe crowded corpses were originally buried, and then somebody crowded them later on. And so we're seeing that the two disputes really are not connected, really are unrelated. We're really seeing that Rabbi Yonah's position holds, that they're not comparable, because as he's saying that we're going to assume that the corpses were properly spaced in the beginning, and then somehow they got crowded, either by Rabbi Shimon's way, where it was an accidental thing, or the earth fell in on it somehow, and maybe they got mixed in because there was a catacomb close by. But nobody would purposefully do that from the start. Nobody would be disrespectful to the corpses like that. The case of the vineyard is going to be a little bit different. Why? Because you're not going to look at how you initially planted the vines. It's not going to be like the case of the graveyard. You're not going to look at it like that. You're going to look at it, how are the vines right now in the current state? And if the vines are properly spaced when they were planted and somebody came and overcrowded it later, that's going to be a case about where Rabbi Shimon is going to be arguing with the sages. This is the clarification that Rabbi Yonah has. It's not going to be whether it's 25 or 36 vines. It's going to be how are those vines are right now. And the question is, if the vines are crowded together, even when they're planted, and then you rip them out later so that it conforms, and it conforms to a vineyard, everybody agrees, presto, it's a vineyard. So you have to look at the status of it right now. In the case of the graveyard, if it wasn't done right and you pull out some of the bodies, did that now become a graveyard? No, it didn't. But in the case of the vineyard, it now turns on as a vineyard if you're going to properly space everything. And so that's what the argument's going to be about. You have to look at what is the status of the graveyard when it's initially set up. You have to look at the status of the vineyard at the time now, right now, not when it's planted. And so those two cases are fundamentally different. Have a great day.